Hey everybody. We're going to give just a second for people to join. Make sure that that's the right link. Doesn't look like anybody's in here yet. Oh, 26. All right, here we are. Again, just for those of you that are new, if you go into the LambdaSchool Slack channel, I am only going to pay attention to the questions channel in there. So if there's something that you'd like answered during the live stream, it's going to be a little bit hectic, but we will do our best to answer those questions. As far as what we're doing today, we're basically going to create a simple HTML, CSS kind of portfolio page, more of a blog really. And your task at the end of the day, your assignment is going to be to recreate that. And just so we're double checking, if you can hear me, can you post in questions that you can hear me and hashtag questions the channel on Slack? There's about a 20-second delay, so I'll wait until I see that. But yeah, today we're going to go over responsive design using HTML and CSS. Great, it looks like you can hear me. And we're going to start out talking about some of the CSS fundamentals that we didn't talk about as much in depth last time. And I saw a few people getting hung up on some stuff that we hadn't talked about yet. So it's not really fair to say, hey, you shouldn't use that stuff because we haven't talked about it yet, but we also can't include everything in one session. So we're going to have to go ahead and find a happy medium there. So I'm going to share my screen. And we'll jump out of that. And I need a new window because I had that open. All right. So we're going to assume that enough people are in by now, and we're just going to go ahead and get started. Hope that works for everybody. So I brought up a CodePen here. For those of you that have never used CodePen before, it's basically HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that are kind of pre-linked. So you don't have to worry about linking them together, but that's the only difference between loading them here and then loading them in a browser from your local computer. CodePen does have a few quirks every now and then. Just because it's not a true browser, it tries to emulate what a browser does, but generally speaking, it works out pretty well. So first, let's look at this HTML and see what we've got. Basically, we have a navbar that's just a div with a class navbar, and then we have a list inside of those things that is called navbar list. And that makes up our navbar. We'll show you how we style that later. And then we have just a bunch of boxes, and they're all just class box, and they have a box inside of them, and that looks like this. So we can see our navbar up here. Here are the individual list items in the navbar. The navbar itself is blue. This is not a design that you should emulate. We're just trying to make it really clear which elements are where. And then down below, we have green divs that are boxes. They have a black border, they're green, and they have the word box on the inside. So the first thing that we want to talk about is what margin and padding are. And this will make a lot of your assignments a lot easier as we go on. First, let's talk about margin. A lot of people get confused between margin and padding, but they're actually really straightforward, and we'll make sure that everybody understands that. So for this box, we're going to say all these boxes are 150 pixels high, they're 300 pixels wide, they have a border that is black, they are green in color, and basically they look like this. So they're just stacked on top of each other, one after another. A lot of you probably saw that in the way you laid out your other HTML elements. And there's something we can use that's called float. And what float does is it basically says, okay, each element we are going to mash it up against this side of other elements. So if we say, for example, float left, each of these boxes, maybe we should, let's do this for just really quickly. There's box 1, there's box 2. We'll only label those 2. But you can see they're kind of mashed up to the left of the next element. And then if we say float right, the same thing, but you're going from right to left. So box 1 is on the far right, and then box 2. So the elements are flowing from the right to the left. And that's something you can do. It's called float. And basically, that will make it so that your divs or your HTML elements, instead of just being piled on top of each other, they'll kind of fall in nicely. So you can probably imagine it, using this, it's pretty easy to create kind of a Masonic type of template. But what we want to talk about right now is 2 things called margin and padding. And we're going to talk about the way that you can apply margin and the way you can apply padding. Because again, it confuses a lot of people, but it's actually pretty straightforward once you look at it. So we can say margin 10 pixels. And all that does is it takes on the top and on the left and on the bottom and on the right, and it adds a 10 pixel buffer between the elements in all of those places. Does that make sense? So all it is basically white space. And if we took our body up here, and let's say we made the background yellow, you can see the transparency in between that white space. Maybe I want to make it something less jarring. Yellow, for some reason, is really bright on my eyes, but we'll clear it up. So that's margin. And then the thing that people confuse margin with often is what's called padding. And hopefully the way that we've displayed it here will make those differences really clear. So if we say padding 10 pixels, basically what it does is it adds kind of an inside border to each of these elements. So you can see the 10 pixels, box used to be mashed right up in the top right, and it's added 10 pixels to the left, 10 pixels to the bottom, 10 pixels to the right, and 10 pixels to the top of each element. So the difference between margin and padding is margin is applied outside of the element, and padding is applied inside. So the question is, when would we want to use something like padding instead of margin? Most of the time you'll just use margin, but padding is really important as well. The answer is, let's take box 1 here and let's put another div inside here. So we'll say div class equals, what should we call it? We'll call it button, which will allude to what we're about to do. And now we have a box div that has a button div inside of it. So they're layered inside of each other. So we can say, okay, button, let's give it a background that is orange, just to make it stand out. Okay, so there's our button div. So what we can do with padding, well, first let's add some margin to it. And we'll go over what the clock way of adding margin now, which you'll see what I mean in just a second. So we can say margin, and we can say 0 pixels, 0 pixels, 0 pixels, 20 pixels. And what does that mean? We go kind of in a clockwise fashion. So we start at the top, and then we go to the right, and then we go to the bottom, and then we go to the left. So top, right, bottom, left, in that order. And we're just working our way around the clock. So what we just did here is we added 0 pixels to the top, 0 pixels to the right, 0 pixels to the bottom, and 20 pixels to the left. So you can see this gap here, and that's the margin. So maybe we want to add 20 pixels to the top and the right, but not the bottom and the left. We can do that just like this, 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 0 pixels, 0 pixels. Or we could even do something like this, 20 pixels, 20 pixels. So when we do that, when we only have 2, CSS just assumes that this one means the top and bottom, and this one means the right and left. So it basically takes this and it copies and pastes it again, but you don't have to say that. Does that make sense? I'm going to jump in the questions channel and just see how things are going. Does it matter what order you put height, width, background, border, float, and padding? No, it does not, unless you override something. So we talked about how what really matters is first of all, what's the most specific, and then what's on the bottom. So if we said here, margin 0 pixels, it's going to override this. And that's a problem that I know that we'll see people have. You'll say, I'm making all these changes, I'm adding margin down here, nothing's changing, and it's because, or you're making changes up here, rather. And you're saying, I'm making the margin 180 pixels, why isn't that making a difference? And it's because you're accidentally overwriting yourself later on down the line. So in the last assignment, you could have used a float, you could have used percentages, you could have actually done that any number of ways, and we intentionally tried to not be specific because you can solve almost every CSS problem in a number of ways. But let's get back to the topic at hand. So we know we go clockwise, we have some margin here. So we go 20 on the top, 20 on the right, 20 on the bottom, 20 on the left. Let's, instead of adding margin, let's get rid of all this margin. And you can see that, interestingly, there's a little bit of margin already built in. But let's go ahead and give this, instead of margin, let's give it padding. And what do you guys think will be the difference? We saw margin, this orange box got scrunched in, it got farther away from the edges. What happens when we add padding? Pixels, just to make it really, really obvious. And what you can see is we're adding to the orange section. Instead of moving the orange away from the green, we're making the button itself bigger. And we're pushing the text in 80 pixels on every side. And we could even do something like centering the text, just so we can see that a little bit better. So does that make sense? One of the ways that we use padding a lot is by creating buttons. So let's go ahead and let's look at this navbar up here. And let's first look at these individual list items within this list. So to break this down a little bit further, all this is an unordered list with a bunch of list items in there. So we could, inside one of these boxes, for example, let's take box 2, we'll create an unordered list, we'll close the unordered list, and then let's put some list items in there. All this is a list, right? It's bullets. And if we wanted to make this an ordered list instead of an unordered list, then your browser is smart and it knows to turn those to numbers instead of bullets. So basically up here, we just have a list. And inside of those, we put the text list item. So how did we get it to arrange like this instead of like this down here? And we'll look at the classes that we created. So we have this navbar class, and that's this big blue div that holds all of the other elements. And I just saw a question, does padding work the same way clockwise? Yes, it works exactly the same way as margin did. So top, right, left, bottom, or top, bottom, then left, right, if you only have 2. So again, we have all of these list items. The nav bar is blue, it's 100% of the width, it's 150 pixels high. You probably saw something like that in your last assignment. You created a lot of bars, basically. And then within this nav bar, we have this nav bar list. In fact, let's go ahead and comment this stuff out for a minute. And what we did to this list is we said list style none. List style none. What does list style none do? It basically takes away the bullet points or the numbers. So whether this was an ordered list or an unordered list, it's just going to remove the styling. Oh, that's 0. It just removes the styling from the bullet points. So now we have basically a bunch of lines of text that are stacked on top of each other. And as we just talked about, one of the things that we can do to make it so that they flow, left to right instead of top to bottom is we can add float. So let's add some float here. I'm seeing some people say that the screen isn't clear, but that's probably your YouTube settings. So if you go into the settings in YouTube and change it to a higher rating, then or higher density, then it will be clearer. That's not something that I can control on my end. So what we did here is now we have a bunch of list items that are flowing left to right. So just to make it clear, let's say list item 1, list item 2, list item 3, list item 4, and list item 5. And so floating them, so we made the list style none, and this has to be applied to the list itself, not the list items, for it to work the way we did it. And then we floated everything from left to right. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're a little bit mashed in there, so let's add some margin between those elements. Let's add margin. Let's add 0 pixels on the top. Let's add 0 pixels on the right. Let's add 0 pixels on the left, and let's add 20 pixels, or sorry, top, right, bottom, left. So we just added some margin right here to this one, and then list item 2 has some margin right there. List item 3 has some margin right there, and so on. So really quickly we can, maybe let's add 50 pixels of margin to the top, bring it down a little bit. We can even add a little bit to the bottom, but we're not close, so that won't make a difference. But since there's each item here, if we add some to the right, it's going to spread them out a little bit more. So we're going to really spread these guys out, kind of double down on margins. We got 10 pixels on the right of each item, and then we have 20 pixels on the left. So we have 10 pixels over here from item 4, and then we have 20 pixels over here from list item 5. So they're pretty spread out. And then let's make the background, let's make it pink. And boom, just like that, we have our little list items. We could make them a button just by making it a link instead of just text, and we just do that with an href. So now the first list item, oh, I did that wrong. That. So now the first item is a link. It's not going anywhere, so we just put a pound sign in there. But that is a working button. And now that that is a working button, all that we have to do to make it look a little bit better is add some padding. Because right now it's pretty sparse. Everything's nudged up against the side. So let's add padding, and padding again follows the same clock pattern as does margin. So let's, just to show you how it works, let's add 80 pixels to the top, and let's add 5 pixels, 80 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels. So we have a lot of pixels on the top, we have not as many on the right, not as many on the left, on the bottom, not as many on the left. And the margin, we have 50 pixels on the top, nothing on the right, 10 on the bottom, and 20 on the left. And you can see already how CSS kind of gets messy because the two rules that we wrote overwrite each other. There's not enough width left in with this 150 pixel tall navbar to support all the width and padding we added. So that's something you just have to be careful of. So let's say instead of padding, let's say we wanted 10 pixels on the top and bottom and 30 pixels on the right and left. We can just say 10 pixels, 30 pixels, boom. And we have our little nav bar. And yeah, that should be working pretty well. So that's basically how you can create a nav bar, and then everything else will flow pretty well. And then down here, what we see is we have a lot of this, all these boxes are shifted over to the left. Let's fix this orange Let's get rid of some of this padding. This is going to drive me crazy. Let's make it 20 pixels. Okay, so we've got all these green boxes. What if we wanted, what if this was text and we wanted it centered? What we would have to do is one of the ways that we could do this. Again, there are always an infinite number of ways that you could solve every problem. But it looks like, so let's create a div and give it a class called container. And then we'll indent all of this because we write good, clean code every time. And let's close the div. Now we have this container element, and we'll try to point that out. Let's do background. What's the color we haven't used yet? Pink? We have used pink. And that actually might be overwritten by the body. Anyway, disregard that. The container is there. And we are going to add some margin to the container. But we're going to do something a little bit different this time. Let me make sure that I created that container correctly. Looks good. Oh, we missed the first box, actually. No, we didn't. It's right there. It's just really small. And we're going to say margin. Just make sure it's working. Let's say 20 pixels, see what happens. Okay, so we can see this whole container, this whole block shifted down. But instead of saying 20 pixels on all sides, we're going to say 0 pixels on the top. And we're going to say something called auto. Let me see if that works. Should say 0 auto. Why would that not be working? We've got container, margin, 0 auto, text align, center. Okay, that's not what we wanted. I'm not sure entirely what I did wrong here, but this margin should be bumping this over. Oh, we have to change. We'll actually do that later. That's more complex than I thought. And then I see a lot of questions around what if we use percentage signs instead of pixels, and that's totally valid. You can do that. So let's look at this box actually. And instead of making this width 300 pixels per box, let's make it, let's say we want 4, we could make it 25%. And there's actually some padding and margin over here. So maybe for now we'll say 22%. And now we're going to have 4. So you can, if we were to go into what looks like the body, in fact, let's do that just for fun. Let's say margin 0, padding 0. You can see how it kind of got rid of those other borders on the side and on the top and bottom, just so we can see that. Let's get rid of those again and do it back. So now the body is literally the full width of the screen. There's not an extra pixel. Actually, there may be because of borders, but we'll have to solve that later. And then we could go up to box, and let's just say 33% for now. And it looks like there's enough border added that, let's say 32, 31. It looks like we have to go up to down to 31% to fill up this screen. We'll show you how to solve that as well. But basically, you can use pixel width and as a percentage, and that will just shrink as far as it can go. And now we're going to show you, now that we've learned how to write all of this hard CSS, we're going to show you how most people write CSS, which is basically cheating. And that is using something that we call Bootstrap. And I'm pretty sure if you've ever seen a website before, you've seen Bootstrap in some form, whether you recognize it or not. So what is Bootstrap? Bootstrap is basically a bunch of pre-written CSS and JavaScript that you can write stuff on top of. So if we look at, this page was used making Bootstrap. Actually, all of LambdaSchool's sites, so if we go to LambdaSchool.com, this was made using Bootstrap, Lambda University as well. this uses Bootstrap. A lot of companies and sites use Bootstrap. And Bootstrap, let's go ahead and look at some of the components here. It has a bunch of pre-written CSS for you to play off of. So for example, here's a drop-down list. And if once you have the Bootstrap CSS, you just have to add this HTML, and it's already written CSS for this drop-down menu. Or down here, it's already added CSS for us, another drop-down menu. But here's a button group, left, middle, and right. And so all you have to do is drop in this HTML, and it's already pre-formatted once you link up the Bootstrap CSS. So I've got a project over here that's just a folder on my desktop that's called project, and inside of it is a file that's index.html, and it's got a head and a body, and there's not too much to it. Actually, before I jump in too far, let's go ahead and look at the questions. Yeah, there's a question. Let's go back to CodePen, actually. That's a really good question. There's a question about using height as a percentage. So what if we said all of these boxes are height 50%? Why doesn't that work? Why doesn't that make it so that each box is 50% of the height of the screen? Basically, I would strongly recommend, unless you know what you're doing, don't try to use height for a percentage. If we use pixels, it'll work beautifully. But height is it's a relative measure to the other elements instead of, you're probably thinking of height relative to the screen. So unless you're trying to make something really span the whole height of the screen, which is still difficult, just plan on using fixed pixel heights or on not doing anything for now and let it just flow. So with that, let's go ahead and jump back into Bootstrap. So Bootstrap, it's a bunch of handwritten or CSS that originally at Twitter wrote. You can hit download, and it's actually just going to redirect us down here. And there are a few ways you can add it. You can download it and then link to those files, or you can also do this, which is a hot link. So it's a CDN link. So instead of linking to a local file, we're going to link to some kind person who put it on the web already and is hosting Bootstrap. So all we have to do is drop our link right in that style sheet. And for now, I'm going to comment it out, but we'll show you what Bootstrap does. So let's make an H1. We'll close it and say, hello world, paragraph. This is my new blog. And we're going to open that in Chrome. Project index.html. So here's what I just created. Here is my new blog. And there we have it. So what does Bootstrap do exactly? We're going to uncomment this Bootstrap. So when I commented that out, that made it so that the browser skims over it and it doesn't pay attention to that. Actually, I don't want to comment out that top line. So we're going to uncomment it and reload. And you can see it kind of takes this Helvetica font. It looks a little bit more nice than your standard browser, and that's basically because Bootstrap has some standard stuff built in. And it's actually not bootstrap.com. I have to Google it because I don't remember where it's at. Getbootstrap.com. And one of the main things that we're going to look at right now is how to do responsive design using Bootstrap. So a lot of you are on the right path. You're asking, is responsive design, does that basically mean we use percentages instead of hard pixel numbers? Because right now, if I have a hard pixel number and I say something's 500 pixels, that's actually wider than my entire iPhone. But it's entirely possible that you want something that wide. on a desktop. In fact, it's really likely. And yes, Bootstrap is completely free. It's open source, and it's really well updated, really well documented. So it'll be the first open source library we use, so that'll be fun. Let's go ahead and look at a Bootstrap grid. And we'll go over what a grid system is as a part of that. So one of the easiest ways to implement responsive design is to, instead of manually resizing each element, you create a grid in advance. So as you can see here, this section, this div class equals row, and then column medium 1, that corresponds to these boxes we see up there. So as long as you create a div class equals row, and then you use this div class equals column medium 1, it's going to have 12 of these stacked across the top. So the Bootstrap grid is what we call base 12. And that basically means you can add whatever numbers you want in here. So let's take this as an example, and we'll pull it into our project. So now we have a div class that's a row. We have a bunch of columns that are column medium 1, and they have the text inside of them that says dot column medium 1. And we can see these columns right here. Just so we can see them a little more clearly, we're gonna have to link another style sheet. So we'll say custom.css. We'll save it in the same folder. And then, because I still don't know how to do this, we're going to Google CSS link. This is what we did last week. And we are going to grab this because that one works. And inside this index, we're going to link that CSS, and we'll call it custom.css just to make sure it's working. Let's do a sanity check. Let's say body background green. Put it up over here. There we go. We've got ourselves a green background, and more importantly, a linked spreadsheet or linked CSS file. So now let's get rid of that. I'm going to bring up both of these at the same time so we don't have to jump back and forth. Usually I would do these either on a separate monitor or on a bigger monitor, but because we have to display it all on YouTube, we're going to have to do a little bit of stretching and shrinking. So let's refresh here, and let's say we're going to overwrite Bootstrap's CSS for this class, and we're going to say background is red, border is 1 pixel dashed, and we'll make it black. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, so for each of these, we have a background that is red and a 1 pixel border that is dashed. A lot of you are asking, when I create a border, why do I have to say solid here? Because that's most of the time when you use a border, you're going to say solid. And that's just because there are different types of borders you can use. Let's actually keep it solid. That works just as well. So what is happening here? What did we just do? We have the Bootstrap CSS and all of those in here. Whoops. And then we have our own style sheet beneath it. The thing is, we are effectively overriding Bootstrap's CSS for the same class. It could be smart just because the way that Bootstrap writes some of its classes to add a new class. So we could say new class, and then, you can do that. And we'll go over that a little bit more later, because sometime, as we talked about with CSS, the way that you win is first by being more specific. If you're more specific, then you win no matter what. And sometimes the way Bootstrap is written is actually more specific than the CSS that you have written. So I actually prefer most of the time to add a new class and change that new class because that's more likely to overwrite Bootstrap without breaking any of the standard Bootstrap stuff. So with style sheets, again, whatever is on bottom wins. So when the browser looks, it's going to look through this entire style sheet, and whatever's on the bottom of those wins. And then whatever's in this style sheet that's lower on the page than this one is going to override everything in this one. So just as an example, if we took this style sheet, our custom one, and put it on top of Bootstrap, actually we're being more specific than Bootstrap, so that's a really bad example. But it's entirely possible that what we wrote is overwritten by Bootstrap if we put ours on the top. So you want to put your custom stuff at the bottom because bottom always wins. But let's go ahead and look at what these columns are doing now. So we have these 12 columns. I'm not going to count them. You'll just have to trust me. There are 12. And they stretch themselves to make it so that 12 columns fits the full width of the screen. And then Bootstrap has trained it so that once you're below a certain size that's supposed to be tablet size, it will break out and they'll all stack on top of each other vertically instead of horizontally. And we can write that ourselves. In fact, we might in a future class. But this call need one, what this means is when we hit a medium size, so a tablet size, break down, and these are one space across. So what if we made all of these column medium 2? Let's just do it for the first 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now they're twice as wide. And our classes don't apply anymore, but we can look at this one and see. Now they're twice as wide. So if we want to stretch it even more, we could let's add something new up at the top up here, a new div. And let's say column medium 12. And that one now spans the entire width of the screen. So you have this grid system built in that will automatically break down for you. And that's going to be the core of responsive design. So let's really quickly create a basic Bootstrap site. So let's start with, let's go to the components here. Let's start with the Navbar, and you'll see how easy it is to use HTML and CSS. Okay, here's a Navbar. We're going to take that, and we're going to go ahead and put it at the top of our body. Boom, we have a Navbar. All right, let's go find, can look for a Jumbotron. Actually, Jumbotron, which is this guy. Let's bring that in, and let's drop in a Jumbotron. And this is, you would definitely indent and make this prettier than what I'm doing. But as you can see, it's pretty easy to start building out a page that looks pretty good. It looks like this is stretched the full width and everything's matched up against the corners. So let's see if Bootstrap has a container. So inside, let's add div class equals container outside of the Jumbotron, so the body has a little bit of room to breathe. So here's our nav, div class equals container, and this is really quickly going to be impossible to read, but it works. Boom, we just scrunched it in a little bit, made it breathe a little bit more. So you probably even recognize the way this looks. The way Bootstrap looks is specific enough if you don't overwrite it that you would recognize just these basic styles. But all the JavaScript is already built in. So if we shrink our screen, look at that. We already have a custom navigation navbar that's already responsive. And that is where we're going to start. And your assignment is going to be to create a Bootstrap site using Bootstrap elements. And then we're going to override it with our own specific CSS. So we're going to take a responsive foundation with a responsive grid, and we're going to make it ours and make it look like our own site. Going back to a couple questions. The Bootstrap code goes into the HTML, but not the CSS, right? Let me show you what's actually happening. And this will take a little bit longer, but it'll be good, just so you understand what that CDN thing is. So if we go to Bootstrap, we say download. There are a few different ways you can use it. Let's just get plain Bootstrap. We're going to open it up. Here's Bootstrap. And Bootstrap has these CSS files. It has some fonts, and it has some JavaScript. So if we want to, we can just copy this folder, the entire folder, put it into our desktop. We'll create a new folder that says, actually no, that folder was CSS, so we don't need that. We'll replace that folder. So just to make it really clear what just happened, we dropped in Bootstrap CSS, and then we can go through, and let's say we want to link to bootstraptheme.min.css. All we have to do in here is, I'm going to make this bigger. We'll get rid of Bootstrap the way we linked it before, and we'll take this, and all we're doing is we're linking to CSS / whatever that file type is, Bootstrap. Let's just do bootstrap.css. And so what you would do if you were adding each of these is you would add all of them at once, and then it'll work the same way. And we haven't copied over the JavaScript yet, so these drop-downs won't work. But that works really well. Question is, what is the impact of the website to have it load Bootstrap from a CDN instead of from the source? So only use the CDN if you're building a test project. When you're building something that you want to go live and you want it to work well, you should always use local files for a few reasons. First of all, it's possible that whoever this CDN company that's hosting it, Max CDN, let's say they go out of business in a couple years and they stop hosting it, or they change something here, that your website is relying on something that you don't control. So if that breaks, your entire site might break, and you might not know why, and you might not find out for a while. So another question is, what if we want to use more than Bootstrap's max 12 columns and don't want to use nested columns? You would either have to find another grid framework that supports more than 12. 12 is just kind of the standard because it's tough to imagine 24 different columns on one site. Or you would have to write your own CSS, as people are pointing out. But by definition, Bootstrap uses 12. So let's go back into here just to make one more thing clear. These are the breaks for the tablet size. So we could also add something for, actually that won't work. Let's do this class. So now this class on your mobile phone, on small, actually mobile phone is usually kind of XS. An iPhone, it's going to be 12 wide, so it's full width, but on a tablet or above, it's only going to be 6, so it's only going to be half the screen. We'll make sure I did that right. But we have this first column here, and it's only half the screen right now, but once we get below a tablet, you can see it goes full width. So you have complete control over the sizing and shape of your elements. So just to see that in action, let's look at LambdaSchool's site. Each of these right here that describe what kind of boot camps we have are, let's see, 12 divided by 3, so they're 4 on large. And then as you break down, once we drop below a tablet size, they become the full width. So if we look at one of these using inspect, we can see column small 4. So once this column hits the small size, it goes ahead. So at larger sizes, it's 4, so it's 1/3. And then once it drops below small, it becomes full width. It becomes 12. That is the easiest way, quite likely, to create a responsive design. Later on, we might build our own grid system, just so you can see. But basically, it's a bunch of percentages. And so we're saying, if we say column is 4, then make it 33.33%. And if it drops below a certain size, then make it so that it's full width. So you could use CSS to override the default size of each column. Yeah, you could. I mean, it's yours. You can do whatever you want. That's probably a bad idea, just because it won't act the way you think. But in theory, yeah, you can do anything you could ever want to do. So yeah, that is the basics of Bootstrap. So now we're going to look at something that didn't save when I wanted it to, but that's all right. What I want you guys to build as a project is this blog right here. And the reason I want you to do that and make it look just like this photo right here. So this right here, we'll take a picture of this using our handy dandy full-size screenshotter, which is a fun little trick. And this is your job, using Bootstrap and your own CSS to recreate this site. Now you'll be able to cheat, because you can look at this and you can right click and you can look at inspect. So we can see, for example, that this is 35 pixels and it's using Open Sans, Helvetica New, Helvetica Arial Sans Serif. So you can cheat, but don't just download it, because that defeats the entire purpose. I'll talk about what that extension was later. I really like it, but I think it's called full page screen capture. So we're just going to post this image right here. And we're going to learn how to build this site. And you've got to admit, this is a pretty good looking site. And for people that, some of you just started to learn to code at all a couple days ago, that's pretty solid accomplishment. So the next, if you want to not use Bootstrap, sure, that's totally up to you. It'll take you more time, but that is your call. And what I want you guys to really see is that after just a couple days of learning these basic principles, you'll be able to build really powerful things. So just looking at this page, one thing that you're going to have to figure out how to do is how to have a header image, or you can cheat and use bootstraps. But then there's a navbar, and this brand is floated to the left, and these are floated to the right. And obviously this is a list, and they've had the list style removed, and the fonts have changed, and the colors have changed, and the padding has changed, and then on down the line. And then this is basically just centered. It's just a big block of text that's centered. You'll have to learn what HTML elements are used to create this block quote. You could actually guess the name of it, and you'd be right. You'll have to figure out how to either, you can do this caption however you want. You can find the correct element for a caption, or you can just put another line of text in there with a new class. And then you're going to have to figure out how to use some icons. So it looks simple, but this is a beastly project to do basically over the weekend. But once you've done it, and once you've worked your way through all the bugs that you will inevitably run into, you'll know how to build pages and sites like this at will. And that's a really powerful skill set to have. And the fact that you've developed that in less than a week with just a little bit of training is pretty incredible. So people are asking why would you use Bootstrap and why wouldn't you use Bootstrap? Bootstrap is something you would use if you want to bootstrap your project and get it together quickly. And there are a lot of really legitimate sites and big companies that do use Bootstrap. There are other CSS frameworks out there as well. Bootstrap isn't the only one. I think it's the most popular, and for beginners, it's definitely the most popular. But the main thing I want you guys to take away from this is that you can start with a goal and a vision, and you can work your way up to building something really powerful, and you can figure things out that you've never learned before as you go along. And those are powerful principles that, we teach a lot in, this boot camp and in the other boot camps. We teach a lot of fundamentals and a lot of principles. But if I could have everybody come away with one thing, that's the idea that in this day and age, anything you could possibly want to learn, you can learn, and you can usually learn it really quickly and really well. And there should be nothing holding any of you guys back from doing anything that you want to do. And that probably sounds a little sappy and motivational, but that's very, very true. And I've seen it happen time and time again. I mean, some of the people that we are working with in the part-time boot camp, they had no programming background. They come from rural areas. They've never had any advantage in the world, but they're going to have really good jobs by the end of the full-time or part-time boot camp. So I just encourage you guys to kind of get rid of any mental shackles that are holding you guys back, because every single one of you is capable of doing something like that. So yeah, play with this, spend time with it, figure it out. And just a reminder that if you want to apply to Lambda University, which is our 6-month program that's free up front, you should probably do that pretty quickly. And we're going to start doing some of the interviews and that kind of thing shortly. But yeah, the next question is, how will this help me become a full stack developer? Well, a big part of the full stack is the front end, and HTML and CSS are the front end of every website. So as we get more advanced, we're going to use JavaScript to write our HTML and CSS programmatically. But if you don't understand what that is in the beginning, then there's no way you can write it programmatically or use JavaScript to create these kinds of pages on the fly. So it's just a fundamental that you have to learn. That's like saying, how will reading and writing help me as a job in literature? Like, that's what it is. So yeah, this is going to be your project, and I will stick around for a few minutes and answer any questions, whether it's about this project, about other boot camps, about Lambda University. We've got about 5 minutes, and I will start watching the questions Slack channel and see what you guys have. If after a couple minutes there's nothing, we'll just close it off. So if you're watching this online and you don't care, thanks. If not, yeah. How would you account for older browsers if you wanted to use units to make sure older browser have some styling when it's compatible? Or is that too complex for right now? Basically, the way you would do that is you would write multiple rules that override each other. We haven't gotten into it yet, but there are some things that aren't supported on all browsers that will require you to create some redundant classes. Luckily, Bootstrap has done a lot of that work already, so everything that Bootstrap uses, for the most part, goes back a really long time and works really well. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel there. But that is a great question. We got several people typing, so let's go ahead and wait. How important is it to understand data structures and algorithms for web development? It is crucial to anything you could do that involves programming whatsoever. Data structures and algorithms are, so you can build sites, you can build web apps without understanding data structures and algorithms, but I mean, you can also drive a car without understanding what's happening under the hood. If you're going to call yourself a mechanic, you have to understand those principles of data structures and algorithms in order to do your job. Unfortunately, there's a big movement right now of boot camps that don't teach that stuff because they don't think they have enough time, which is insane. That's like saying, hey, we're a mechanic school, we're just not ever going to open the hood. I don't know how you can sleep at night saying that that's what you do. You have to, you have to understand how to use data structures and algorithms. How late can we apply for the part-time class without it filling up if we applied for Lambda U? We're going to make sure that everybody who applied to Lambda U will have a chance to apply to the other boot camps as well. Because the acceptance rate of our normal boot camps is really low, but the acceptance of Lambda U is looking like it's going to be very low. So we'll make sure that you have a chance to do both. So if you're interested in both, apply to both. Some of the application process will run in parallel, so you might have a couple separate phone calls, maybe a couple different code challenges. But if you want to do Lambda U, but you're not sure if you'll get in, and you want to do the part-time or the full-time, and you're not sure if you'll get in, just apply to everything, and then we'll work that out based on what you get into. All the videos are archived. Yes, the same link that you used to view this video will be the link forever. The screen grab tool I used, it's just a Chrome extension. It's literally called full page screen capture. Let me see if I can find it. Full page screen capture. I think that's it. Yep, that's the one. Full page screen capture. I can link it. What's all this about full stack training camps focusing on Rails instead of HTML and CSS, or Rails and Node.js? So Rails and Node.js are like, how do I describe this? You can't have one without the other. Like Rails and Node, by definition, like Rails and Node let you do more powerful things than just HTML and CSS, but at the end of the day, they display in HTML and CSS. So that is how that works. How do you know when to use column medium, extra small, and so on? And when would you need to use more than one size when thinking of responsiveness? It really comes down to your design. So if you want something to be, there are times, what if instead of saying we wanted this to be 3 columns on a desktop and then we wanted to drop down to 1? What if we had 4 and we wanted it to turn into a grid of 2 and 2? That's when you'd use something like that. So you could say, hey, on a medium screen, let's make these 3 columns, but on a tablet, let's make them 2 instead of 1. So you have total control over how things look and what size they are based on how wide the screen is. Yeah, so let's take a couple more questions. What's the link for the homework website? How is that written? Yeah, so you would just, if you're doing something like that, you would just add extra classes. So you could say column medium, so like we did right here. We could even write column small 4. So what this one's going to do is on a large screen, they're going to be half the width. On a phone, they're going to be full width. And on a tablet, they're going to be a third of the width. So that's probably a rare use case, but you can definitely do that. Is this bootcamp divided into 4 sections of each a week? If so, does that mean we will start JavaScript next week? We will start JavaScript next week, but that's not because it's specifically divided up into 4 weekly sections. That's just happens to be what happens. Yeah, you're right. I missed a letter there. So yeah, that is the class for today. I think we're going to wrap up. And I will post this on lambdaschool.com/mini-bootcamp/archive right now, and then we'll have it up. I'll drop the screenshot in the Slack channel so you can start working on it over the weekend. And we will see you guys on Monday. Thank you.